The day I became the most hated person in my neighborhood was the day I discovered I owned it. It began, as these things often do, with something laughably small, a ridiculous $50 fine. But what Brenda, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association, didn't know was that I had inherited something far more valuable than the land my cabin sat on, something that would dismantle her meticulously constructed kingdom brick by brick. I promise you won't see this ending coming. I had moved to Lakeview a year prior, seeking solace. The city, with its relentless hum and unforgiving concrete, had become a cage after my wife, Eleanor, passed. We had shared a dream of a quiet life by the water, a place where the air smelled of pine and damp earth, where the loudest sound was the whisper of wind through the trees or the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. This cabin, nestled on a tranquil cove of Lake Ashworth, had been her dream as much as mine, a place my grandfather, an eccentric and shrewd man, had built with his own hands generations ago. I had spent my life building a career in corporate finance, a world of cutthroat negotiations and ruthless takeovers. But after Eleanor, the battles felt meaningless. I craved peace, a quiet harbor to mourn and rebuild. The cabin itself was a rustic jewel, weathered cedar siding, a wide porch facing the water, and a small, well-worn dock where I often sat for hours, a fishing rod propped beside me, simply watching the ripples. It was more than just property. It was a living memorial to Eleanor, a physical manifestation of the future we had planned, and a testament to my grandfather's enduring spirit. Every creak of the floorboards, every splash of the lake, resonated with memories, a comforting balm to my grief. I gardened, I read, I learned to identify the myriad calls of the lake's birds. My mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching the mist lift from the water, and ended with the stars reflecting on its still surface. It was my sanctuary, my refuge, and I guarded its peace fiercely, though quietly. Enter Brenda. She materialized one Tuesday morning, her arrival announced not by a friendly wave, but by the crunch of her oversized sport utility vehicle's tires on my gravel driveway, followed by the authoritative slam of its door. I was on the porch, nursing a mug of herbal tea, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water. She was, in essence, the universal, I want to speak to the manager, haircut personified. A severe, asymmetrical blonde bob that seemed sculpted from plastic, paired with a perpetually pursed mouth and eyes that missed nothing and judged everything. Her clothes, a crisp white linen pantsuit and an assortment of expensive gold jewelry, screamed new money, attempting to blend with old money, and failing spectacularly. She carried herself with an air of self-importance that grated, as if the very air around her was waiting for her command. I had seen her at the last HOA meeting, where she had dominated the conversation, interjecting with sharp, often condescending remarks, but I had hoped to largely avoid her orbit. "Mr. Holloway," she stated, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, stepping onto my porch without invitation. Her tone was not a greeting, but an accusation. "Are you aware of the regulations regarding watercraft on Lake Ashworth?" I turned slowly, setting my mug down. "Good morning, Mrs. Davies." "I am, generally. Is there an issue?" I asked, my voice calm, belying the instant irritation that had begun to prickle under my skin. My grandfather had always taught me that the calmest voice in the room often held the most power. She gestured dramatically towards my small, weathered fishing boat, tied securely to the dock. It was a modest craft, nothing more than a simple rowboat with a small electric trolling motor, a perfect tool for quiet morning fishing. "The HOA bylaws are quite clear, Mr. Holloway. Personal watercraft over 12 feet in length, or with any form of motor, are expressly forbidden unless registered with the association and approved by the Water Committee." "That boat," I replied, a small smile touching my lips, "is 9 feet long. And its motor is electric, barely more than a toy. It hardly qualifies as a watercraft in the sense of disrupting the peace of the lake." Brenda's pursed lips tightened further, forming a thin, white line. "The bylaws state, any form of motor, the length is irrelevant if it possesses an engine. Furthermore, your fishing activities are often disruptive. Mr. Henderson, at Lot 7 reported you fishing within 20 feet of his property line yesterday. Mr. Henderson, the man who had 3 loud, barking dogs and mowed his lawn at 6 in the morning on Sundays. The irony was not lost on me. I was fishing for bass, Mrs. Davies. I said, my tone still even. The fish don't observe property lines, and I always stay a respectful distance from any docks or swimming areas. Respectful distance is subjective, she retorted, pulling a clipboard from a large, expensive-looking tote bag. She wore a self-satisfied smirk, a clear sign she relished this small exercise of perceived power. The rules are not. This is your first warning, accompanied by a $50 fine for non-compliance and unregistered watercraft. Should you persist, further fines will be levied, and we will consider suspending your lake access privileges. My lake access privileges. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with a false authority that grated on my very soul. I looked from her self-important face to the serene expanse of a lake, my grandfather's lake. $50. It was a pittance to me, but the principle of it, the sheer audacity of this woman attempting to dictate how I used a place so deeply personal, so utterly mine, with a red rag to a bull. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, the cold, analytical part of my brain already beginning to spin. Understand, I said, keeping my voice deceptively calm. I will review the bylaws. She nodded, a triumphant glint in her eyes. See that you do, Mr. Holloway. We run a tight ship here at Lakeview. Order, decorum, and compliance are paramount. She turned, her expensive shoes crunching back down the gravel, leaving behind a faint scent of expensive perfume and an undeniable feeling of trespass. The internal debate began the moment her sport utility vehicle disappeared down the winding drive. My first instinct, the one honed by years of navigating corporate bureaucracy, was to simply pay the fine. $50 was a trivial amount, a mere annoyance. Peace, I told myself, was more valuable. I had come here to escape conflict, not to invite it. My grief was still raw, a tender wound that I carefully shielded from any fresh pain. Engaging in a petty battle with the HOA president felt like stirring a hornet's nest I had no desire to disturb. But then the quiet, persistent voice of my grandfather echoed in my mind. He was a man who had built his life on integrity and principle, a man who wouldn't tolerate a bully. He had carved this piece of paradise out of sheer will, nurtured it, protected it. He taught me about roots, about legacy, about standing your ground when someone tried to take what was rightfully yours, even if it was just a tiny piece of dignity. Arthur, he'd say, a man's home is his castle, and what's outside his door is often more important than what's within. If it dictates what you can do inside, he meant the land, the air, the water. He understood the profound connection between a man and his domain. The lake was more than just a body of water. It was the heart of this property, the very reason it existed. It represented peace, healing, and a tangible link to Eleanor. To cede control, even over a small, electric motor, felt like ceding a piece of my soul. The decision to fight solidified then, not in a burst of anger, but with a cold, clear resolve that had served me well in the boardrooms of my past life. This wasn't about a $50 fine. It was about protecting my sanctuary, about upholding my grandfather's legacy, and perhaps about reclaiming a small piece of the control that grief had stolen from me. I was done being reactive. I refused to be bullied, not on my own land, not in the quiet haven I had sought out precisely to avoid such aggressions. Brenda Davies had declared war, and she didn't even know who she was fighting. She saw a grieving, quiet man. She didn't see the seasoned financial predator, the legal strategist who had dismantled companies and uncovered countless frauds. She had mistakenly prodded a sleeping giant. My background in corporate finance, particularly my specialization in mergers and acquisitions, required an almost obsessive attention to detail, a forensic ability to dissect contracts, deeds, and regulatory filings. My mind, once a steel trap for market trends and complex legal precedents, now turned its formidable focus to the minuscule world of Lakeview's HOA. I cleared my dining table, spread out county maps, property deeds, and a laptop. My investigative process was methodical, almost ritualistic. I started with the Lakeview Homeowners Association itself. I pulled their articles of incorporation from the state Secretary of State website. I downloaded every publicly available document. The original declarations of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, known as CC and RS, the HOA bylaws, meeting minutes, and financial statements. I combed through everything, looking for anomalies, for clauses that might have been misinterpreted, or, more intriguingly, for omissions. The HOA's authority, I knew, was derived from property easements and restrictive covenants written into the deeds of the individual lots. They managed the common areas, the roads, the landscaping, and often the amenities like a clubhouse or a community pool. But a lake? A natural body of water often presented a more complex legal challenge. Was it truly common property, or was it privately owned, with the HOA merely overseeing certain access points or recreational rules? I spent days, then weeks, burrowing deeper. I pulled the original plat maps for the entire Lakeview development, dating back to its inception in the late 1960s. These maps, filed with the county recorder, detailed every parcel of land, every right-of-way, every easement. It was like peeling back layers of history, searching for the core truth. I followed the chain of title for my specific lot, tracing it back through decades, through various owners, to the original developer. My grandfather, Arthur Sr., had been one of the very first purchasers. He had bought not just the land for the cabin, but a significant portion of the surrounding undeveloped acreage. It was in an old, faded plat map, tucked away in the county archives, that I found it. A small, almost imperceptible detail that shattered everything Brenda Davies thought she knew. The lake itself, Lake Ashworth, was not marked as common property or HOA land. Instead, a large, irregularly shaped parcel, encompassing the entire lake bed and a significant portion of the immediate shoreline, was designated as private property, Arthur Holloway Sr. Trust, a trust. My grandfather, ever the shrewd businessman, had known. He had bought not just the land for his cabin, but the very water it fronted. When he sold off the surrounding acreage to the developers of Lakeview in the late 60s, he had explicitly retained ownership of the lake itself. The HOA, when it was formed, had been granted easements for access points and certain recreational use, but the fundamental ownership remained with the Arthur Holloway Sr. Trust. My heart hammered against my ribs, a thrilling drumbeat of revelation. It was a perfectly legal, if highly unusual, arrangement. My grandfather, anticipating future disputes, and perhaps wanting to preserve the lake's natural state, had created this trust, ensuring that the lake would remain his, and by extension, his family's, domain. And as his only living heir, the trust had passed to me upon his death a decade ago. I had been so focused on the cabin itself, on its emotional significance, that I had never fully scrutinized the full extent of the property my grandfather had left me. I had simply assumed the lake was a common resource, like everyone else. The irony of Brenda's lake access privileges threats was almost unbearable. I didn't have lake access privileges, I was the lake access. The revelation was intoxicating, a potent antidote to the quiet despair that had clouded my days. The analytical gears in my brain, dormant for too long, whirred to life with renewed vigor. This wasn't just a win. This was a complete, undeniable tactical advantage. It was a loaded weapon, aimed squarely at Brenda Davies's misplaced hubris. My first call was to Dr. Elizabeth Evans, my old property law professor from law school, now a revered, semi-retired real estate attorney with a reputation for sharp intellect and an uncanny ability to navigate legal labyrinths. She was precisely the kind of wise ally I needed. I flew to her office in the city, carrying a thick binder filled with copies of all my findings. The original plat map, the trust documents, the deeds, and the HOA bylaws. She listened patiently, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her astute eyes missing nothing as I laid out the narrative, from Brenda's initial affront to my painstaking discovery. When I finally finished, she leaned back in her leather chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Arthur," she said, her voice a low rumble. Your grandfather was a genius. And you, my dear boy, have inherited his knack for finding the devil in the details. This is quite frankly exquisite. So, the HOA has no legal standing to fine me for my boat or to dictate fishing regulations on the lake. I asked, though I already knew the answer. None whatsoever, she confirmed, tapping a manicured finger on the original plat map. Their authority extends to the land and common areas that are explicitly conveyed to the association. The lake and its bed falls squarely outside their jurisdiction. Their rules regarding watercraft, fishing, anything pertaining to the lake itself, are entirely unenforceable. They were likely written into the bylaws under the assumption that the lake was common property or that the original developer would eventually convey it to the HOA. But your grandfather ensured that never happened. He created an impenetrable legal fortress around that lake. What about the easements? I asked, recalling the clauses I'd read. Those grant the residents access to the lake for specific recreational purposes, provided they adhere to generally accepted norms of behavior and safety, she explained. They do not grant the HOA regulatory power over the body of water itself, nor do they confer ownership. You, as the owner of the lake, retain the right to impose your own, reasonable rules and regulations on its use. You could theoretically charge them for access, although given the history, that might be aggressive, she chuckled. But you could certainly prohibit types of watercraft, set fishing seasons, even ban swimming if you wished, provided it doesn't violate any existing environmental regulations, which it won't. This gives you absolute leverage. My mind raced, already formulating the strategic outline. So, the strategy, then, is to let Brenda dig her own grave. Dr. Evans nodded. Precisely. Let her continue to overreach, to issue more fines, to threaten. Every action she takes based on her false premise strengthens your case for a comprehensive legal response, should it come to that. Document everything. Every letter, every phone call, every interaction. And most importantly, do not reveal your hand until the absolute opportune moment. She paused, her eyes gleaming. This is not just about winning, Arthur. This is about justice. And it's about making a very public example of someone who has abused their power. Over the next few weeks, I became a phantom observer. My new hobby was meticulous evidence gathering. I installed discrete security cameras around my property, angled to capture any unwanted visitors or activities near the lake. My smartphone became an indispensable tool, ready to record any interaction. I frequented the local coffee shop, casually engaging other residents in conversation. It didn't take long to realize Brenda's reign of terror extended far beyond my property line. Mr. Henderson, despite his earlier complaint against me, confided that Brenda had fined him for planting the wrong kind of azaleas. Mrs. Chavez, a sweet, elderly woman who loved to feed the ducks, had been threatened with legal action for attracting undesirable wildlife. Young Dr. Liam Riley, who had just bought a small cabin nearby, had received a cease and desist for practicing his trombone on his porch, despite the noise ordinance being vague. The narrative was consistent. Brenda, riding roughshod over the community, imposing arbitrary rules, and wielding the HOA's power like a cudgel. I quietly collected their stories, their frustrations, their fines. I encouraged them, subtly, to keep copies of all correspondence, to document their own interactions. I was building a coalition, a quiet resistance that would rise when I finally pulled the rug out from under Brenda. It was like assembling an arsenal, each piece of evidence a bullet, each frustrated resident a loaded chamber. The game was on, and Brenda, bless her arrogant heart, had no idea she was already caught in my sights. My first move was subtle, a whisper before the storm. Following Dr. Evans's advice, I sent a formal letter to the HOA board, through her law firm, politely but firmly disputing the $50 fine. The letter was a masterpiece of legal understatement. It cited the exact sections of the HOA bylaws Brenda had referenced, but carefully pointed out that those sections pertained to common areas and shared amenities, without explicitly stating my ownership of the lake. It requested clarification on how a private, 9-foot electric rowboat could possibly be considered a motorized watercraft subject to their rules, and it subtly questioned the HOA's authority over the lake itself, asking for proof of title or easement that granted them such regulatory power. It was a precise, surgical probe designed to elicit a response that would further expose Brenda's arrogance and lack of due diligence. Brenda's response was exactly what I had hoped for, a display of unbridled fury and overreach. She didn't bother with a formal board response. Instead, a week later, I received a certified letter, not from the HOA's legal counsel, but from Brenda herself, on official HOA letterhead. Her tone was dismissive, condescending, and bristling with indignation. She accused me of being a disruptive influence and of attempting to circumvent clear community guidelines. She doubled down on the fine, raising it to $100 and added a new charge: obstruction of HOA duties. The letter threatened immediate suspension of my lake access privileges and stated that if the fines were not paid within 7 days, a lien would be placed on my property. She was so convinced of her own authority, so blinded by her hubris, that she didn't even recognize the legal landmine she was stepping on. She interpreted my quiet, legally sound inquiry as a direct challenge to her personal authority, and she responded like a cornered viper. The line was crossed a few days later. I had spent the morning on the lake, fishing for bass. As I reeled in my line, preparing to head back to the cabin for lunch, I saw Brenda standing on my dock. This wasn't just a casual visit. She had clearly made her way around the shoreline. Behind her, 2 burly men, hired hands from a local landscaping company, were attempting to unmoor my boat. "What in the blazes do you think you're doing?" I yelled, rowing furiously towards the dock. Brenda turned, a smug smile plastered across her face. "Mr. Holloway, since you insist on flouting the rules, the HOA has decided to impound your unauthorized watercraft. It will be stored off-site until all fines are paid and proper registration is completed." "You can't do that," I shouted, tying my boat off to the dock post. "That's private property. That's theft." "The HOA has the right to maintain the peace and safety of the lake," she declared, puffing out her chest. "And you are disrupting it. We are removing an unregistered, non-compliant vessel." "It's a clear violation." As she spoke, one of the men clumsily fumbled with the mooring line and in his haste accidentally kicked my favorite fishing hat, a faded, well-loved cap that Eleanor had given me, off the dock. It landed with a soft splash in the water, floating gently away. A cold, quiet rage settled over me. That hat, a simple piece of fabric, was imbued with the warmth of Eleanor's memory. It was an insignificant object, yet its deliberate defilement, the casual disrespect for something so personally meaningful, ignited a firestorm within me. My grief, my desire for peace, evaporated, replaced by a singular, consuming drive for retribution. This was no longer just about property lines or arbitrary fines. This was deeply personal. Brenda Davies had touched something sacred, and she would pay the price. The sleeping giant was fully awake, and he was ready to unleash hell. The master plan, honed over weeks of meticulous preparation, was finally ready for execution. I had arranged for a special, unscheduled HOA board meeting. I had subtly suggested to the community members I had befriended, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Chavez, Dr. Riley, and several others, that they attend, hinting that important matters regarding lake access would be discussed. Brenda, predictably, took the bait. She was ecstatic, believing this was her meeting, her opportunity to publicly chastise me and solidify her reign. She had even sent out an email to the entire community, boasting about the meeting and promising to bring order and accountability to the rogue elements. It was the perfect stage, set by her own hand, for a public unmasking. The community clubhouse, usually half empty for HOA meetings, was packed. A nervous buzz filled the air. Brenda, seated at the head of the long table, radiating smug authority, began the meeting with a flourish. She droned on about budget surpluses, new landscaping initiatives, and then, with a dramatic pause, turned her attention to me. "And now," she announced, her eyes narrowing. We must address a persistent issue that threatens the very fabric of our peaceful community. Mr. Arthur Holloway, despite repeated warnings and fines, continues to disregard our clear bylaws regarding lake usage. His motorized boat, his disruptive fishing, and his general defiance have necessitated more stringent measures. She held up a copy of my lawyer's letter, waving it dismissively. He has even gone so far as to question the HOA's authority over Lake Ashworth itself, a ridiculous claim that borders on the absurd. Let me assure you, the lake is a common amenity, managed by this board for the benefit of all residents. We will not tolerate such insubordination. She concluded her tirade, expecting applause or at least hushed agreement. Instead, the room was silent, all eyes on me. I stood slowly, calmly, clutching my well-worn leather briefcase. I had dressed simply, a plain button-down shirt and chinos, a stark contrast to Brenda's power suit. My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, but it carried across the room, imbued with the unshakable confidence of absolute truth. "Thank you, Mrs. Davies," I began, nodding politely. "I appreciate your summary, though I must disagree with several of your assertions. However, before we delve into my alleged insubordination, I believe it is essential that we establish a foundational understanding of who, precisely, owns Lake Ashworth." Brenda scoffed. "That's preposterous, Mr. Holloway. Everyone knows the lake is community property, overseen by the HOA. "Oh, do they?" I asked, my gaze sweeping across the room, locking eyes with several of my quiet allies. Because my research, painstakingly conducted through county records and historical documents, tells a rather different story. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a large, rolled-up document. It was a blown-up, pristine copy of the original plat map. I walked to an empty easel at the front of the room and unrolled it, carefully securing it in place. The room murmured with curiosity. "This," I stated, pointing with a laser pointer, "is the original plat map for the Lakeview development, filed with the county recorder in 1967. As you can see, each individual lot is clearly delineated. And here, I moved the laser, highlighting the large, irregular shape that encompassed the entire lake, is Lake Ashworth. Now, pay close attention to the designation here." I zoomed in further, the words "private property, Arthur Holloway Senior Trust" clearly visible. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Brenda's face, which had been set in a sneer, visibly slackened. Her eyes darted from the map to me, a flicker of genuine fear entering their depths. "My grandfather, Arthur Holloway Sr., I continued, my voice gaining a quiet power, owned this land long before the Lakeview development existed. When he sold parcels to the developer, he meticulously retained ownership of the lake bed and the water rights. He then placed it into a trust, ensuring its preservation and preventing it from ever being controlled by an external entity like an HOA. Upon his passing, that trust and the ownership of Lake Ashworth passed to me, his sole heir." I paused, letting the bombshell land. The silence in the room was deafening. Every eye was on Brenda, whose face had gone from smug to pale to a mottled crimson. "Therefore," I said, turning my gaze directly to her, "the HOA has precisely zero authority over Lake Ashworth. You cannot fine me for my boat, which is legally permitted on my own private property. You cannot dictate fishing regulations. You cannot suspend my lake access privileges, because I'm the owner of the lake. Any rules you have enforced regarding the lake, any fines you have levied related to its use, are not only null and void, but likely constitute a significant legal liability for the HOA, given they were enacted without any legitimate basis of authority." Brenda found her voice a strangled, desperate sound. That's impossible. That's a forgery. The lake is a common amenity. We've always managed it under a false pretense, Mrs. Davies. I corrected, my tone unwavering. I pulled out more documents, the original trust documents signed, sealed, and notarized. I have the chain of title. I have legal opinions from Dr. Elizabeth Evans, one of the foremost property law experts in the state, confirming my ownership. And I have a full accounting of all fines levied by this board related to lake usage over the past 3 years. Fines, I might add, that were collected illegally and must now be returned. I gestured to Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson, were you fined for planting the wrong azaleas on your property or for a perceived lake violation? For fishing too close to someone's dock, Mr. Holloway, by her, he said, pointing a trembling finger at Brenda. $50 last year. Mrs. Chavez, I continued, were you fined for feeding the ducks or for a legitimate violation of a common area rule? The ducks, Mr. Holloway, Mrs. Chavez said, her voice small but firm. She said they were making a mess and attracting vermin. She fined me $100. Each testimony chipped away at Brenda's crumbling facade. The murmurs grew louder, turning into an angry clamor. Residents, now armed with the truth, felt the betrayal keenly. Brenda, once their imperious leader, was suddenly exposed as a fraud, a petty tyrant who had wielded power she never possessed. She tried to interrupt, to shout me down, but her voice was lost in the rising tide of indignation. Furthermore, I concluded, holding up a file of documented complaints, I have compiled a comprehensive list of other grievances, including the unauthorized impoundment of my personal property and numerous instances of arbitrary rule enforcement and abuse of power by the current board, specifically Mrs. Davies. This is not just about the lake. This is about accountability. The power shift was instantaneous, breathtaking in its speed. Brenda's attempts to regain control were futile and pathetic. She stammered, she blustered, she threatened legal action against me. But the residents, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage, had seen the truth. Her authority evaporated before their very eyes. Someone called for a vote of no confidence. Another suggested a full audit of the HOA's finances. The meeting, which she had intended as my public humiliation, had become her undoing. The reign of Queen Brenda was over. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Brenda Davies. The HOA board, once firmly under her thumb, fractured. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the palpable fury of the community, most members quickly distanced themselves from her. Within days, a formal investigation into the HOA's financial practices was launched, prompted by my detailed reports of her questionable expenditures and the illegal collection of lake-related fines. It didn't take long for the auditors to uncover significant discrepancies. Lavish board entertainment expenses, suspiciously high consulting fees paid to a company owned by Brenda's brother-in-law, and a general pattern of financial mismanagement that bordered on outright fraud. She resigned in disgrace, of course, before the full extent of her alleged malfeasance became public. But that wasn't enough. The community, emboldened by their newfound freedom, wasn't letting her off that easily. Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Chavez, and the others, armed with my evidence and the realization of their own victimhood, initiated a class-action lawsuit against her for fraud, abuse of power, and emotional distress. The legal pressure, combined with the public humiliation, was immense. Her expensive sport utility vehicle and her crisp linen suits were no match for the weight of the truth. Within months, Brenda Davies, once the self-proclaimed monarch of Lakeview, was forced to sell her lavish home to cover her legal fees and the burgeoning restitution claims. The last I heard, she had moved to a small, nondescript apartment far from any lakes, presumably to avoid being reminded of her spectacular downfall. Her meticulously curated world had imploded, and the irony was she had pulled the trigger herself. Now in a position of undeniable power, as the benevolent monarch of Lake Ashworth, I approached the task of dictating new terms with a quiet thoughtfulness. This wasn't about vengeance, not anymore. It was about restoring balance, about fostering a genuine sense of community. My first official act as the lake's owner was to create a new, comprehensive set of Lake Ashworth usage guidelines. These were not restrictive, but rather protective. They encouraged responsible recreation, emphasized environmental stewardship, and outlined common-sense safety measures. My small electric boat was, naturally, fully compliant. Large, noisy motorboats, however, remained forbidden, a decision overwhelmingly supported by the residents who cherished the lake's tranquility. Next, I established the Arthur Holloway Senior Lake Trust, renaming the original trust in my grandfather's honor. Its purpose was to manage the lake for the benefit of all Lakeview residents, ensuring its beauty and health for generations to come. I appointed a small committee of residents, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Chavez, and Dr. Riley, to oversee its operations, establishing clear, transparent rules for access and maintenance. There would be no more arbitrary fines, no more power grabs. The committee would ensure fair access for fishing, swimming, and quiet boating, while also coordinating cleanup days and conservation efforts. The lake, once a flashpoint for conflict, became a symbol of unity. A new HOA board was elected, comprised of sensible, community-minded individuals who understood that their role was to serve, not to rule. The atmosphere in Lakeview shifted dramatically. The pervasive tension eased, replaced by a tangible sense of peace and cooperation. Children laughed louder on the community playground. Neighbors chatted freely over fences. The community, demonstrably better off due to my actions, felt like a true home again. Life by Lake Ashworth returned to its tranquil rhythm. My mornings once again began with coffee on the porch, watching the mist lift from the water, the quiet lapping of waves against the shore. I still fished from my small boat, now with a renewed sense of belonging and ownership, a quiet joy bubbling beneath the surface of my grief. The memorial bench Eleanor and I had always talked about, a simple wooden seat by the water's edge, was finally installed, a place where I could sit and feel her presence, knowing the peace she sought had been secured. I had found my sanctuary not just through passive retreat, but through proactive defense. The lake, once merely a beautiful backdrop, now held a deeper significance. It was a testament to my grandfather's foresight, to Eleanor's enduring spirit, and to my own capacity to stand firm in the face of injustice. The greatest bullies, I had learned, were often undone by their own arrogance, their downfall precipitated not by overwhelming force, but by the quiet, methodical application of truth and leverage. True power, I had come to understand, didn't come from wielding authority, but from knowing precisely what you owned and having the courage to protect it. And sometimes, standing up for what's right means not just winning a battle, but reshaping the entire landscape of your world.